Hi everyone, I'll just give it a couple of seconds for people to enter and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome all. This is our third session this morning. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. João Saraiva. João is an ethologist with a special interest in welfare. He is joining us from Portugal, where he leads the Fish Ethology and Welfare Group at CCMAR and is the president of the Fish Etho Group Association. He'll be discussing fish ethology and the impact of fish farming. Over to you, João.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you again for the organization to put me up in such a nice panel of speakers, and for organizing such a nice conference. I will try not to overlap too much with Callum and Lynn's presentations, but I will talk to you about how ethology can be a key aspect to assess and improve the welfare of fish in aquaculture. And basically, we are all here because fishes are misunderstood. So the public perception of fish as an animal and their sentience and intelligence are largely underrated in the general public. And fish are surrounded by the myths of the 3-second memory and not experiencing pain, and as my previous colleagues referred, the sheer wording of the use of harvest as fish being the cereals of the ocean is a clear depiction of how much fish are misunderstood animals. But there are ways to understand fish. And I would like to propose the ethological framework that Nico Tinbergen and obviously Carl von Frisch and Konrad Lorenz laid out with the establishment of the ethology as a scientific discipline. And these three scientists were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1973, and it laid out the foundations of ethology as of an established scientific discipline. But the actual work the prize was an award for the work that has been developed from many years before, and the the 4 questions of ethology, which were actually published by Nico Tinbergen in an obscure journal of German ethology in 1963, were actually the basis of all this. And it wasn't even for ethology that he postulated these questions. He made them as the 4 basic questions that we can look at when studying any biological phenomenon. So these are complementary perspectives on any biological problem. So they deal with the function, causation, so the proximate mechanisms, the development and ontogeny, and the evolution of any biological trait that we're looking at. Of course, when we're looking at behavior, development and causation are the answers to the how questions, and whereas function and evolution are the answers to the why questions. In other words, the how questions deal with hormones, brain, learning processes, developmental processes, whereas the why questions deal with adaptation, evolution, and natural and sexual selection processes surrounding any given behavior that we are observing. And before we go further, I would like to address just a problem with definitions. In ethology, there's a common conundrum with the use of words. And we are talking about welfare, and if you ask welfare to someone who is not involved in the field, they will say, well, welfare is something to do with feelings, it's something to do with the well-being, and we have to define our variables so that we can measure them. And fortunately, Donald Broom in 1986 defined welfare very elegantly as the individual state as it copes with the environment. And this means that the welfare can be good and can be bad. And there's a continuous, it's a continuous variable which we can measure using indicators. And welfare, and these indicators may be from three different, may come from three different perspectives. One is the health perspective, which is the function-based approach, which deals with mechanisms, physiology, and basically the veterinarian approach to animal welfare. And then Marion Dawkins in the 80s suggested the feelings-based approach, so the mindset of an animal, the animal emotion perspective. And other authors suggest that the nature-based approach, we're looking at the opportunity of the animal to perform natural behaviors as if they were in nature. And these are all complementary. So only by incorporating these three perspectives, we can have a full assessment of the welfare state. And it's very easy to understand why. For example, if you only take the health perspective, a man in prison in solitary confinement may be in perfect health, but he's surely not experiencing welfare. So only by incorporating these different aspects may we have an holistic approach towards welfare. Another issue that we have to define is sentience. So Colm and Lynn have already gone through this, so I won't take too much time on this. So sentience is the ability to experience positive and negative affective states, which is the incorporation of subjective and perceptual experiences. And another very, very interesting definition that just came about from the International Association for the Study of Pain is that there is a definition of pain. So we can use that definition to assess the sentience and the suffering of animals. So pain is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with or resembling that associated with actual or potential tissue damage. And this wasn't even postulated by animal researchers. This is a medical association that that made this this very objective definition of what pain is. And this may be exceptionally useful when dealing, when talking to and discussing with veterinarians that usually say that, we don't even know what pain is for humans. How can we say that for animals? And Colm has already addressed that aspect very well. So we can have this ethological approach towards any behavioral feature that we see in fish, and aggression is a quite simple one to have, especially if you're talking about cichlids. So tilapias are probably one of the most farmed fishes around the world, and they are very aggressive fish. In the wild or in farms, or if you're using them as experimental animals, you do know that they can be very aggressive. They have very conspicuous aggressive behaviors. In fact, that's why they're such a nice model to study aggression. And then we can look at aggression with an ethological approach, and then try to incorporate that into welfare. So we do know, answering the how questions, we do know that aggression is dependent on the action of hormones such as androgens and cortisol that rise in periods of social instability. All the sensory input coming from vision, hearing, lateral lines, magnetic senses, and all that is incorporated and integrated in the brain. And within the brain, there is an upregulation of certain pathways such as the AVT, the hypothalamus pituitary gonad axis, and the serotonin and dopamine pathways are upregulated in the brain. And then there are also learning aspects with aggression. So fish can learn by association, and then can eavesdrop, and they can have fantastic capabilities such as transitive inference. So just by observation, fish are able to understand that if A is dominant onto B and B is dominant onto C, so A is dominant onto C. So this this simple association that we take for granted as humans is in fact used in fish to plan the future actions. But all this is not this is not stable throughout development. So there are ontogenetic aspects to understand when studying aggression in fish, also basically because, and very simply, juveniles may not be as aggressive as adults. And then we may also look at it from the why perspective. So why does aggression occur? Well, it occurs because fighting is adaptive to acquire resources, and also knowing when not to fight is also adaptive. And all these aggressive behaviors have evolved in many, many channels. And in cichlids, this is remarkable in how much they have maybe developed chemically or visually or acoustically with all these, the incorporation of all these signals, and how it has evolved throughout their radiation. And of course, all these traits are subjected to natural selection. So fighters acquire more resources, but they're also subjected to sexual selection, because fighters have also access to more females, so they have more reproductive success. And this is a trait that is selected throughout evolution. But we can also look at more complex aspects of fish behavior with an ethological approach, such as sentience. And sentience obviously has a physiological basis. So there are nociceptors, there are nerve fibers, which are in fact very similar to mammals. And all this information is also incorporated in certain areas of the brain, as Colin explained early on this morning. And these areas are not homologous, but they are analogous to the amygdala and neocortex in tetrapods, which are known to be related to the processing of fear and noxious stimuli. There's obviously a learning component to avoiding pain and experiencing pain. But all this experience of all this sentience matters may also have a developmental component. And regarding the why questions, it's also obvious that it's adaptive to feel pain. So experiencing pain and avoiding noxious stimuli and remembering why why is that noxious is obviously adaptive, because basically in nature you survive. And we also know that pain and fear are conserved traits throughout the vertebrate lineages, and also, as Lynn also pointed out, also under invertebrate lineages. So we share these traits with a very remote common ancestor. And obviously, natural selection favors those who experience and remember pain and stress and fear, because basically these animals survive and pass on their genes to their lineages. Those who do not survive obviously don't pass on their genes. And the only aspect that I could not remember or think of is sexual selection. So if any one of you can think of how sentience and pain sensing can be sexually selected, I would like to hear about it. But then with all this knowledge, we can ask ourselves, why does this matter? And what can you do with all this? Well, it matters, obviously, because of ethical reasons and of coherence reasons with the treatment of other animals. So we do take care of the welfare, even legally, of farm animals and land animals. And why should we not do the same with fish, especially now that we understand that fish are capable of having the same capacities as other animals. It also matters because fish that experience good welfare are fish that are a better product for food consumption. So farmers and the industry have all their interest in providing the best welfare for their fish, because it's a better product. So there's an added value of having a welfare fish. And in fact, this certification of good welfare is something that we have been working on, but it's also something that my colleague Maria Filipa Castanheira will address in the coming days. And finally, there's a very prominent reason to take care of fish welfare, which is public health. So especially at the slaughter point, when fishes are subjected to horrendous suffering with asphyxia, this also leads to health problems and the invasive and the outbreak of diseases. And we all know what happens when you know, in wet markets, when animals are not properly don't have their welfare addressed properly. And what can we do with all this? So using an ethological framework, we can assess species-specific requirements. We can provide species-specific needs. So we can improve the life and the death of farmed fish. And we can proactively adapt the method to the fish and not trying to shove fish into the few farming methods that exist. And using this framework, we can easily see, as also Colm said, and I don't want to repeat myself or repeat his words, but we can also easily reach the conclusion that some species may not be suitable for farming. And there are reasons outside the suitability, the biological suitability of farming to farm these species, such as salmon, but they may not be biological suitable for fish farming. If we use, when we compare ethological indicators with physiological indicators, we come to the conclusion that ethology has an advantage over physiology, provided that people are properly trained. So if we assume that people at fish farms or in the industry are trained in ethology, ethological and behavioral indicators maybe are as reliable, at least, as physiological. They are species specific, they are objective, they have a high marginal value. They may be easier to implant because what we do is a way to observe the fish, there's no other way around it, but they are relevant and they are practical. And especially when we're talking about physiological indicators such as cortisol. Cortisol is a very complex hormone. So we tend to think of indicators as a high number is bad, and especially in cortisol, a high value of cortisol is bad and a low number of cortisol is good. This is not always the case. And it's not easy to measure cortisol in a reliable way. And so ethological indicators have an advantage, and especially because we don't need much technology to do that. So we can observe even general patterns of behavior and use that as indicators. For example, and these are general, and these are a rule of thumb, and this may be adaptable to all the species, yet taking into consideration that species have different reactions to farming stimuli. But for example, changes in major behavior patterns are early warning signs, which are non-specific, but we can assess that something is going wrong just by knowing that behavior has changed. Surface activity at harvest point or at fishing point there's already a scale which we can use to assess the welfare of fish at the point of harvest, which is a surface splashing. And high surface splashing, where the whole body of the fish splashes out of the water and jumps around, is a sign of very poor handling practices. And obviously ventilation rate has already been referred. It may reflect hypoxia, but it may also reflect handling, confinement, or social stress. And there are indicators that are already validated for some species. For example, for the African catfish, food intake is reduced when they are in low density. So catfishes are is a species that are very used to having to living in very high densities in very poor, between brackets, poor quality water, even in nature. So if you farm them at a density which is too low, they will be under poor welfare. And one of the signs is that they reduce feeding. And they also reduce swimming activity when they are farmed in low density. However, when they are farmed at the density which is too high, they start to develop what we call the stereotypical behaviors, which are swimming in circles in a small area of the tank, especially at night when they are supposed to be more active. Is if they show these stereotypical behaviors, this may be a sign that the density is wrong. But we also can adapt this ethological framework and the ethological knowledge to other species, such as the gilt-head sea bream. The sea bream is the basis of Mediterranean fish farming, and it's very important species in Italy, Spain, Turkey, Greece, and also in Portugal. But by knowing the ethology of a sea bream, we can improve their welfare. For example, by environmental enrichment. I will not go too much into that because Pablo Archivala Lopez will talk about that in a dedicated talk. But I would just like to share with you some of the data that we have from our own research. What you see in your screen is the top view of sea cages with gilt-head sea bream. And with regular non-enriched sea cages, these are the points of the cage which are mostly occupied by the fish are mostly the edges. So the center is almost always empty. However, if you introduce very simple enrichment features, in this case, we're just hanging ropes from the top of the cage, you do have a change in the spatial pattern. So they use a lot more of the space, and that leads to an improvement in body conditions because they are more separated. They don't engage and don't interact aggressively as much, and they don't interact with the net as much. So very simple measures such as this environmental enrichment leads to very clear results in improving with an improvement in welfare. And also they lead, this is not only seen from the top, now this is a three-dimensional view of a net pen. The behavior changes also in terms of depth. So at night, when you have environmental enrichment such as this, so just hanging ropes from the top of the net, you have a higher use of the space of the net. So there's a whole changes in behavior with very simple measures just by knowing, for example, that the sea bream uses features from the substrate. So it's a benthic fish that uses substrate, that naturally uses rocks and features of the substrate. So if you provide them with with something that looks like natural features, they will use them and it will improve their welfare. So by using this ethological approach, we can identify welfare key points and improve their welfare simply by stabilizing social systems, providing abundant and proper distribution of resources, having predictable routines, and providing fish with some control over their environment. And you can do this by environmental enrichment. But again, we have to really understand the species that we are talking about. And all this will give opportunities for the expression of natural behavior and will decrease aggression, at least in theory. But knowing this, it has been proven that if you apply this knowledge properly, you will decrease aggression. But also when it comes to sentience. So if you identify the type and frequency of disruptive stimuli, and you reduce those stimuli and you introduce more predictability and more refined routines, also provide control over the environment and properly thought out environmental enrichment, you will have lower stress, lower pain, lower suffering, and lower negative emotions. And also, by knowing what happens in the brain and the hormones, we can even treat these negative states with drugs or with proper stunning methods. So in summary, by using proper ethological knowledge, we may, on one hand, use behaviors as indicators and have proper monitoring and assessment. But we also may choose behaviors as suitable adaptations and use that knowledge to refine standard operational procedures and refine them to achieve a better welfare. And then we may think of this in a general framework as selecting the best species and thinking that we have more or less 500 species of fish presently farmed compared to circa 30 species of land animals. This is quite a challenge to select only the best species, but then you can choose also the appropriate methods and develop the best protocols. And again, we can also use this knowledge to apply it practically. And one of the things we have been doing is developing the Fish Ethobase, which is an online and open access database on fish ethology and welfare. We aim to cover all the species that are currently being farmed. We are now at the 50 mark, and we want to go as far as possible. And this is a long run process project, but we have been doing this for the past years, and it's very rewarding to see that people are using it as a resource more and more. So just go by fishethobase.net and visit this and let us know what you think. And the other way of applying this practical knowledge on the ethology and welfare of species is the CareFish project. And this is a project that we have been developing for the past 2 years with the Friend of the Sea certification scheme, where we visited 50 fish farms throughout the world in 12 countries, and they cover 24 species. And we do so having a practical approach. We go to the fish farms, we make a first visit. 1 month later, we delivered a report free of cost to the farmers with assessment and recommendations. And then about half a year later, we do a second visit to those farms and talk about the feasibility of such measures that we suggested, and how do they deal with that? Do they look at it as being positive or not? And then with all this knowledge, we made a big stakeholder discussion to deliver welfare standards and in Friend of the Sea certification. And it must be noted that up to very recently, there were no relevant welfare requirements in any fish certification scheme. So we aim to do this with the participation of fish farmers to develop feasible, auditable, and relevant requirements to improve the lives of farmed fish. And one of the frameworks that has been lingering around is the thing around mitigation measures. So this is a sort of a reactive attitude towards fish farming, because we assume that fish farming will be bad, but we just do this small measures that try to mitigate the harmful impacts. But I think we need to depart from this and be more into a positive welfare and a quality of life framework in a much more proactive attitude, by selecting the best species, by refining the methods, and then implementing all this in a much more proactive way of thinking. And Becca will talk about positive welfare, and my colleague Leonor Gallardo has been talking about the quality of life perspective for a while now, and it seems to be a much more useful and positive way of thinking. No pun intended. So just to finish off, I would like to invite you to visit our website. It's a bit of a shameless promotion here, but we do think we're doing lots of good things. And one of them is the fish welfare online course, where we try to incorporate all these perspectives, this ethological perspective on the proximate mechanisms, the biological basis of welfare, sensory systems, ethological approaches, behavioral approaches, and then also a practical approach on how to improve the lives of fish. So again, and you have to excuse me for this a bit of promotion, but this is something that we are also very proud of, that we have a very high number of experts doing the lectures, and we are also very thankful to them for being present in the course. So I would like to finish off just by thanking you, and I'm open for questions. And these are, I suppose you will have all the presentations afterwards, but these are the references that I talked about in the talk. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was super informative. It's really great to have had the research and then hearing about this like implementation from research and the work that you're all doing, and the Carefish project sounds so fantastic. Okay, so let's take some questions. One from Paul. Joao, we both participated in the AAC seminar a few weeks ago, and there were fish farmers there that told us that they see differences between the fishes they farmed and the original species in the wild. And they want even more with fish species that can cope better with stress. You said the farming system should adapt to the fishes and not vice versa. Indeed. What should we say to fish farmers about this?
Well, the domestication issue is something we have been discussing for a while, and as you know, Paul, in the that meeting at the AAC, Phil actually took the time to explain why domestication isn't really an issue in fish. Obviously, fish are being selected artificially. So basically, what fish farmers or the industry does, on purpose or not, is select the fish that grow faster and eat more. And this is because fish farming is a business. So if you may decrease the cost by having a younger fish reaching commercial weight faster, that's what they will do. But however, this may be more plasticity than actually domestication. So fish are plastic. The phenotypes are plastic. So they do respond to artificial selection, but if you put these fish, their basic needs do not change. So if you understand that this is always the same species that exist in nature, and if you can provide them with the most natural features, if you can understand their ethology and understand why are they aggressive, why are they fearful, you will improve the welfare of that fish. Of course, you can select more resilient strains, or you can go to more resilient species, and that's it may be all good, but you cannot understand, you cannot assume that in 40 generations, which is roughly what salmon has been experiencing, for example, or a little more with carp, but they have been domesticated for hundreds of years. Whereas goats and dogs and sheep and cows have been for tens and thousands of years. And they have been selected through a very slow process, and we are rushing the process of artificially selecting fish, but they are not different species, so the basic needs are the same as in nature. And of course, generation by generation, you will have different responses to artificial rearing processes. But again, these are not different species. So if you provide them with ethologically based enrichment or routines or whatever, they will respond positively for sure.
Great, thank you so much, Joel. And if you want to stop sharing your screen, and then everyone can just see you've got on the screen. No, don't worry about it, it's all good. Okay, so next question, people are upvoting things, but one that was voted first for two. Phil Brook and Alison Mood say, to what extent does domestication affect the ethological needs of fish, and how well do they adapt to the aquacultural environment?
Well, Phil, I guess you answered already this question, but this is on one hand you do have responses from the fish to artificial selection processes. So you do have fish that react less to farming routines, for example, but they are basically the same genome. So this is not a different species. So if you can select the strains that stress the less, but in the process of reaching the original, the parents, these are basically the same fish, and you can keep on selecting, but it's complex to say that you will end up with a much better strain or a much better species. So again, if you go back and look at what these species are experiencing in nature, you will have your answers there on how to improve their welfare. And the fact is, because you have pushed the growth, for example, the growth and the weight gain and the speed of growth of fish in such, or tried to at least, in such quickly as we are doing with salmon. There's a huge industry around artificial selection of salmon, and also sea bream and sea bass and all that. But they are basically the same species. There will be features that are selected along with growth. For example, aggression is one of them. So you will have problems with selecting fast growers because they will be bolder, they will be more aggressive. But again, these are always the same species. So if you reverse that, if you release these species into nature, the first generation will be for sure less resilient to, all the things that are in nature that are not as stable as in fish and farming conditions, but they will eventually adapt because they're basically the same species.
Good to know. Okay, so Neil says, great presentation, thanks. Freedom Food salmon standards have been around for many years. I'm interested that you don't seem to consider to count them as a certification scheme, given your statement that no certification scheme includes welfare requirements until recently. Why is that?
Well, I know this was a bold statement, and I would just trying to call the attention to all the fish certification schemes that actually try to address this. Actually, I am aware that, for example, the RSPCA has a very good standards for trout and salmon. But what I wanted to say is that sometimes these requirements are not effective or they are not relevant. And the RSPCA is a very good example of that. And people, for example, complain that the limits for density in the RSPCA standards are too high in trout. But the fact is, they relied on experimentation, they relied on research, and we reached the conclusion that trout in nature, for example, they are used to swimming in very dense schools. So density per se is not the problem. The problem is all the stuff that is associated with density, which is water quality, the amount of food, for example, the access to food. So these are indirect consequences of high densities. So I'm sorry if I offended or somehow brought this into people moving around their seats. So this is not true. But the fact is, sometimes even the welfare requirements may not be as effective as they assume they are. But again, Maria Filipa Castanheira, my colleague, will address this in the certification talk. I think it's tomorrow or the other day. So yeah, she will address all this, the certification schemes in detail.
Great. Thank you. One from Lynn. She says, thanks for a super talk, Joel. There are a lot of welfare issues in farmed salmon in sea cages. Using an ecological approach, what changes would you make to salmon farming to improve their welfare?
Thanks, Lynn. That's a nice question. Again, salmon, as Callum said, salmon is a very, in theory, you should not rear salmon. Thinking strictly about biology of salmon. They are migrating species. They go from saltwater to freshwater. They spawn. They spawn in a very complex way. So all the changing environments, the use of the environment that they do, along with the developmental stages where they are, is super complex. So I think that providing, for example, environmental enrichment would be a nice idea. providing complexity, adding complexity to the environment, providing withdrawal opportunities, escaping opportunities. All of this could be very good. And again, I would not go too much into detail, because Pablo Arechivala Lopez would also deal with all these effects of environmental enrichment, and it will also touch salmon. But I would go with environmental enrichment, and adding complexity to the rearing environment seems to be a good idea. But again, I leave it to Pablo to to address this.
Yeah, something to look forward to as the week goes on. Okay, so Anna says, is the observation of behaviour well received in aquaculture industry, as they need to allocate more humane resources for that, even if you use video, as somebody has to watch it?
Well, from our experience, it does. It is well received, in the sense of there is always people watching the fish either way. I mean, when you feed them, even if you have automatic feeders, there's always someone looking at the cameras to monitor whatever diseases, predators, the state of the cages, and so on. So the main problem would not be the number of people, would be the training. And this is a very important aspect. And this is something that we came to talk with the fish farmers and say, we know that you are the ones in touch with the fish, and you have the opportunity to identify all these issues. But without proper training, what you see is probably not well interpreted. So you cannot provide the best solutions to the problems that you are observing without knowing it. So training here is the key. It's not just the allocation of more human resources. I would say that probably there will have to be more people providing, making observations of fish, but these people are already there anyway. It's just they have to be trained and trained thoroughly and regularly and all that. So it is well received, but you have to be careful with the approach that you give.
Yeah, I can imagine. Great. Okay, so Jose says, apart from octopuses, and now that production in aquaculture has surpassed that of catches, what species of aquatic animals ethologically unsuitable for aquatic culture are most at risk of starting to be produced in greater numbers on fish farms in southern Europe? He's in Spain.
Well, yeah, octopuses are a blatant example of a species not to farm. But I don't know. I mean, for example, the meager has been developing as a species in fish farming recently in Europe, mostly because it occupies more or less the same environments, and it's been around for a while as an auxiliary species, but not as primary. So only now they're addressing this. But this is, for example, this is a very big fish that can reach very big sizes. So technically, it's a challenge. And for example, I would not go into new species, but I would certainly highlight the fact that sea bream and sea bass are usually reared together, or using the exact same technologies, but these are very different species. And anyone who has worked with sea bass knows that sometimes you sneeze and they die, but they're very stressful by nature, and they're cryptical, for example, and they're predators. They're avid predators. But so is sea bream. But in this case, they are very resilient, and they will eat everything, and they will chew on anything that you give them. So other than not farming a species in Europe, because most of the novel species are from other countries. There are novel species in Europe also, but most of the novel species come from other countries that we just put them in a tank and see what happens. I would just go to refining the processes and understanding that sea bass is not sea bream and it is not a meager, and they all have species specific needs.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot to take in actually, and just hearing about sea bream and sea bass, I didn't realise that they were so different. So Stephen says for catfish, could not reduced feed intake and reduced activity at lower stock intensity be interpreted as a sign that they are less stressed and hence metabolic demands on the body are decreased, rather than a sign of poor welfare?
It could, but if you compare with what they do in nature, the magnitude of this reduction is not compatible with the good welfare state. And this is where the gold standard that we use as behavior in nature is the reference for good welfare. Because we have to, have a framework to compare it to, because otherwise we will just throwing numbers to guessing. So having something to compare to is essential, and obviously behavior in nature is the gold standard that we use. And if you observe catfish in nature without stressors, without predators, in good water quality and good social, in a constant social environment, you will see that they have a feeding frequency and a swimming activity patterns that are higher than what you find in low density. So this is why we say that these are signs of poor welfare.
Interesting, thanks. So Anna says, Joao, thank you for a great talk. What kind of environmental enrichment would you recommend for farm tilapia?
Tilapia, so now we come to a very complex issue. So tilapia is a very interesting animal to work with, and all cichlids are. And I've been working with cichlids for, 15 years now. And it's remarkable how they do the exact opposite of almost any other species, because if you provide them with, if you don't think about too much about the environmental enrichment that you will provide, you will cause more harm than good. So this is an obvious case where you really need to understand the fish you are working with, or what you are farming, because tilapia are very territorial, and they breed throughout the year. So there's not a breeding season, and they mature very fast. So even the smallest fish are aggressive and are territorial and are able to at least theoretical spawn. So if you introduce resources that are not enough for the whole population, you will get monopolization of resources, and you will get a territorial fish monopolizing the resource and exerting violence and aggression on other fish. So you'll get growth asymmetries, and you will get injuries, death, and all that nasty things. So the problem with the environmental enrichment in tilapia has always been providing them with the distribution of these resources, so whatever environmental complexity you are talking about, and the abundance of such resources, so that you do not create an unstable social system where you have lots of aggression. And the people in Brazil from the University of São Paulo have been researching on this a lot, and there's no simple answer to that, and that's the fact. You really have to provide them with enough resources so they can all benefit from the enrichment, and you have to separate them enough. You have calculated the size of the fish and the size of the territories that they will eventually get, so that you don't get monopolization of these resources and then exclusion of some fish from the access of such resources. So it's a very complex topic, environmental enrichment in tilapia.
It sounds it. I'm actually interested because I've heard before that tilapia is the fish that might be okay to farm if you were going to choose a species, but then there obviously sounds like there's quite a lot of complexity with that.
It is. I mean, we say this and we risk our necks saying that because they have the potential to be farmed under good welfare, because they are very plastic and adaptive, and they are cognitively, they're very developed, so they can adapt to their environment if you provide them with the correct one. And this is a big if. Just that.
Sounds like it. Great. Well, Susanna says, thank you for a great talk. I love fish ethobase. Any chance that lumpfish will be added, and maybe even wrasse?
Lumpfish, yes, it's on our list. RAS, it would be an obvious choice, yes, but I think we would go for lumpfish because we already have some knowledge on that and some requests, but we try to focus on the fish that are farmed for consumption and then eventually farmed for auxiliary fish. But you're totally right. I mean, in numbers, the cleaner fishes are getting more and more important and have been neglected for far too long. So yes, I guess Jenny, also the editor-in-chief of the Fish database, is always already also watching the talk. So I guess she's taking notes now.
And Suzanne is doing a talk later this week all about the welfare of them, so people can learn there. Anna says, regarding selection, this is just a speculation. Can we associate it to the Y situation where male needs to endure suffering and pain of a fight to get the female?
That can be. Why not? I mean, that's a good, actually a good answer. I will incorporate that in my in my little table there. Thanks. That's a nice idea.
Nice. That's good. Kushik says, if we are to do public campaigning for changing public perception on fish, should we portray in different forms such as blog articles, images and videos their natural behaviors?
Yes, that would be a resounding yes. I mean, as Callum and Lynn already said, I mean, we have this complex relationship with fish where we pay heaps of money to go to aquaria and see fish in their natural environment, and then I guess all of us like to see documentaries of of how developed fish are and all these very bright colors and complex behaviors, and then we eat them without thinking too much on their welfare, and there's the cognitive dissonance here. So we appreciate the fantastic fish that we see in the aquarium, but then we eat the fish as it was, you get my point. Mm-hmm. So yes, and the fact is that we have to link the sea bream that we have on our dishes with the sea bream that we saw in the documentary and that we portrayed in the blog and in magazines and journals as being a live individual animal that has personality, that has a life of its own, an inner world. And this is the link that is, I guess, it's still missing, and there are reasons for that. But this is the extra step that needs to be taken.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. And then final question from Rag, comparing wild fish behaviour with captive fish behaviour seems quite a weird approach, as context is totally different, so you're comparing incomparable scenarios. Actually, for aquaculture experts, it's possible to observe behaviour changes for the same species from nature to captive. One of the examples will be, for example, flatfish, which in nature are solitary animals, and in captivity they perform better from stress reduction, pathologies, etc., when at high densities. Seems logical that a species tends to adapt to their environment. Same happens to humans. Why fish ethobase compare wild with captive?
Well, that's an easy answer, because we need to have something to compare to, basically. And these animals evolved in a certain environment for millions of years, and it may be by chance that they may seem better off in captivity in different conditions, but they are equipped to deal with some features of the environment that are not present in aquaculture. So this is why we believe that behavior in the wild is the benchmark for welfare. And I don't, of course, fish may obviously are not always under the optimal welfare in nature. Sorry?
Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah, no, that's
okay.
True.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, well, that rounds up everything. And Farah says thanks for the talk, and I agree. It's been fantastic in answering all those questions. It's been super interesting and insightful. So thank you so much for your time, and thanks for great questions, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.